organization Human Rights Watch says it's worried that Russia is using what are called cluster munitions in its invasion of Ukraine. And that claims these munitions have been used on at least one hospital and at least one preschool for young children under international law, various treaties. These would appear to be illegal. Lo Charbonneau is the UN Director at Human Rights Watch. He joins us now. Lo, good day to you. What exactly are cluster munitions? What makes them so dangerous?
So cluster munitions are a particularly gruesome type of weapon. There is an international law that bans them. And the reason is because they're inherently indiscriminate. You can't target with a cluster munition because what they do is you'll shoot a missile, say, with a warhead that contains cluster munitions, and then inside the warhead there will be dozens, sometimes even hundreds of bomblets, smaller bombs, which then spread across a very wide area, about the size of a football field. And then those explode. So it explodes in the air, spreads these bomblets all over the place, and then anyone who comes near them, can get killed or seriously injured. And then sometimes they don't explode, so you have these duds, which are then basically landmines, which if someone picks them up, they might go off and then, kill or maim people. So very, very ugly things. And even though Russia and Ukraine have not signed the international treaty banning them, which South Africa has, they're still obligated not to use these kinds of things because you can't use indiscriminate weapons.
So in other words, it's something, you can't work out if it's going to kill a child or a soldier. You just throw it in the area and it's going to kill whoever's there. And it may not even do that. It may only do that in 10 years' time if it doesn't go off properly.
In theory, yeah. You just basically, it's like a kind of express mining of areas. Very bad type of weapon, and no one should be using it. Not Russia, not Ukraine, not anyone else. And this is why South Africa and 108 other countries have signed a treaty banning them.
There's some weapons, for example, there are important reasons why landmines should be banned and why many countries won't use landmines. But there's sometimes tactical reasons why the United States will use landmines on the border between Korea and North Korea, South Korea and North Korea, for example. Can there be any tactical reason that would mean that Russia has no choice but to use cluster bombs in its invasion of Ukraine? I can't think of one, I must say.
I mean, you can probably, if you think hard enough, come up with a tactical reason for using these kinds of things, but, it's very difficult, and particularly when we're talking about an urban setting. I mean, the cases that we and Amnesty International have documented, we're talking about a hospital and a preschool, and there was a small child that was killed in the preschool, another one that was injured, and then the case of the hospital, there were 4 civilians who were killed, there were 10 more who were injured, including 6 health workers. There's no military tactical reason for using a weapon of that kind in that type of situation.
You made the point that South Africa, we had signed the international treaty that actually says you shouldn't use these things, that they should be banned. So our soldiers wouldn't use them under any circumstances as a result of that. And yet, and I must bring this up, we abstained last night in the United Nations General Assembly debate on the resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As Human Rights Watch, how do you view our action in abstaining in that debate?
Well, it really was an unfortunate occurrence, the abstention from South Africa. I mean, the abstainers, the other abstainers include the likes of China, Cuba, Burundi, Mali, Nicaragua. And so the question I ask to the South African leadership, is this really the club South African leaders want to join? I mean, yesterday's abstention, in some senses is an insult to the legacy of Nelson Mandela, who's one of the great human rights defenders in history. And when a country like Russia disregards human rights, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, by bombing civilians in Ukraine, including by using cluster munitions, as we were just talking about, South Africa should be condemning it loudly and clearly. They shouldn't be abstaining. So there's really no justification. And I certainly hope that next time there is a vote in the General Assembly, when South Africa has a chance to show where it stands, that it will not be choosing, on the basis of some flimsy justification, standing with Russia, because that's really what it is. Now, when China abstained, that was like a vote against Russia. But when South Africa abstains, a democracy, a country that believes in human rights, it's like voting no and siding with Russia.
So what actions are there then? What can be done to stop Russia using, what actions can be taken against Russia for using these cluster munitions? And that presumably brings in the International Criminal Court. Is this something they would investigate?
Certainly. I mean, all kinds of war crimes, serious war crimes, these are the things that the International Criminal Court can, should, and hopefully will investigate, because 38 countries have requested that the International Criminal Court investigate the situation in Ukraine. And the court, its chief prosecutor, will be investigating all sides, not just Russia, but at this point we've been documenting largely war crime, possible war crimes on the part of Russia. There are other things that the international community could do. I mean, South Africa was right yesterday to point out that the UN Security Council shouldn't be ignored, but at this point, the idea that the UN Security Council is going to do something to put pressure on the parties to the conflict to negotiate, to stop engaging, particularly Russia, to stop engaging in possible war crimes and attacking civilians, using indiscriminate weapons. I mean, there's no realistic chance that's going to happen because Russia has a veto, and it's used its veto multiple times. Going back to 2014 when this crisis began, after Russia annexed Crimea and then was backing separatists in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. So the idea that the Security Council in this circumstance is going to do something, this is one of the justifications that the South African delegation gave for its abstention. I mean, it's hopelessly unrealistic. It's not going to happen. Hopefully the General Assembly can keep putting pressure on Russia to begin complying with its international obligations, international human rights law, international humanitarian law. We also have the Human Rights Council, which is hopefully going to approve a commission of inquiry to gather evidence of possible war crimes, and then this can be used by the International Criminal Court. And so my appeal to South Africa is support the International Criminal Court, support the General Assembly, support all avenues that all international organizations that we as the international community have at our disposal to protect civilians, to help put pressure on the Russians to put an end to these possible war crimes, because the day may come where they are held accountable at very high levels in Russia, and they need to know that. There should be no impunity for what's going on, and I think South Africa needs to lend its voice to that. It's a very important, influential country, and people look to South Africa for leadership on these issues, and it's not too late for them to show it.
Have other countries used cluster munitions before and got away with it? I mean, have there been investigations there? I'm looking for sort of precedents here, and I mean, in a way, one shouldn't actually look for precedents because you should judge what people do on the merits. Because one person did something bad and got away with it isn't an excuse for someone else to do something bad and get away with it. But is there any sort of international legal precedent in other countries that use cluster munitions and there was some kind of investigation?
Well, I mean, the cluster munitions have been used in multiple situations. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Syria, for example. And Syria is an important example because we saw how Russia, largely working from the air, the Russian military wreaked quite a bit of devastation on the civilians of Syria. And one of the things that we have been worried about is that, some of the war crimes that we saw committed in Syria could be repeated in Ukraine and on a similar scale. And hopefully that won't be the case, but Russia for many years now has been actively engaged in testing out all kinds of new weaponry. There are other concerns that we have about other indiscriminate weapons, but maybe I'll hold off on that for now until we have more evidence that we can speak about publicly.
Hello, Charbonneau, thank you very much indeed. United Nations Director at the organization Human Rights Watch. I do appreciate the time.